Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. As David was mentioning, I don't do it anymore, but I used to be the editor-in-chief of Psych Science, which was like being in grad school when steroids. The first year in 2012, we got about 2,700 manuscripts submitted. I read and wrote a review of about 1,000 of them. And there were lots of really incredibly good papers. Most were really outstanding. But that said, I was oftentimes disappointed by what I wasn't reading. Very seldom, as indicated there, did submissions to the journal either justify their sample sizes, report effect sizes. You don't really know how, other than just raw significance, p-value, whether it was actually a meaningful effect or not. They seldom made it plain whether any pertinent variable, independent or dependent, had been dropped and for what reason. And prospective power analyses, which you typically should use to figure out what your sample size would be, occurred about as often as Halley's Comet. So it just gives you an idea sort of what the status was. So as I was thinking about that, I thought that I could probably do a better job if I knew more about the story behind the research, and particularly about the decisions that went into why they did what they did, why they described it, how they reported things. And that became a focus for the next several years. That same basic kind of conclusion was made, as it turned out, just a couple months earlier in Psych Science in November 2011 in a very elegant, sort of complex paper by Simmons, Nelson, Simonson, which is appropriately called False Positive Psychology, Undisclosed Flexibility in Data Collection Analysis Allows Presenting Anything as Significant. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by anything here, quite literally. Again, it's a complex paper. There's a lot of math simulations and all that, but the key argument really boils down. It's pretty straightforward, and it's reflected in two experiments. These are real experiments that they ran. And so I'm just going to go through them really quickly, but this kind of gets to the point. One was, they called it a musical contrast and subjective age. And basically the idea was that if you're a college student, a university student in your early 20s, if you listen to a kid's song, it's probably going to make you feel older. There would be like a musical, like an age contrast effect, so to speak. And so to do that, would listening to a children's song induce an age contrast? So they had 30 University of Pennsylvania undergraduates. They listened to a control song, which is Kalimba, which is the ridiculous little thing goes off when you play Windows 7, or to a children's song, which was Hot Potato by the Wiggles. So you listen to either of those two musical pieces. Next, the students are asked to complete an ostensibly unrelated survey. One of the questions, the key one of interest to us here, is how old do you feel right now? And they respond to 5 options: very young, young, neither young or old, old, very old. And as predicted, they got what they thought they would get. People felt older, the students felt older after listening to Hot Potato rather than to Kalimba. In principle, you could get the reverse as well. If you're in your early 20s, for instance, if you listen to a kid's song, you should feel older. By the same token, had you listened, say, to a song that would think about old age, you should presumably be younger. And that's the topic they pursued in the next study, except with a twist, because what they wanted to look in here is not just simply whether you would feel younger, but whether you would actually become younger, which is an interesting hypothesis. And so what they did in this case is they said that this is actually quoting directly from the write-up. And quote, using the same methods as in study 1, we asked 20 Penn undergraduates to listen to either When I'm 64 by the Beatles or Kalimba. Then in an ostensibly unrelated test, they indicated their birth date and their father's age. We used father's age to control for variation in baseline age across participants. And then the key punch is at the end, and again, this is a direct quote, and ANCOVA, analysis of covariance, revealed the predicted effect. According to their birth dates, people were nearly a year and a half younger after listening to When I'm 64 rather than to Kalimba. That's interesting. You know, you usually think you would actually become literally physically younger as a result of listening to a song. And that kind of strains credulity. Well, it turns out it does strain credulity because what's important, this is what they actually reported. But what they actually should have reported is indicated on here. So what black is in black is what I just read to you. What's red is what they should have included, but they didn't. So briefly, using the same method as study 1, we asked, actually turned out to be 34 students, not 20. They dropped 14 people. Not clear why. and they'd listen only to either When I'm 64 by the Beatles or Kalimba, and then they don't mention that they said they also included Or Hot Potato by the Wiggles. We conducted our analyses after every session of approximately 10 participants. We did not decide in advance when to terminate data collection. Long story short, they stopped when they got a, quote, significant effect. That's basically it. Then in ostensibly unrelated tasks, they indicated their birth date and then all these other things that they don't mention. How old they felt, how much they would enjoy eating at a diner, the square root of 100, their agreement with the statement, computers are complicated machines, their father's age, which is the only thing they actually did mention, their mother's age, whether they would take advantage of an early bird special, their political orientation, which of 4 Canadian quarterbacks they believed had won an award, and how often they referred to the past as the good old days and their gender. They didn't mention any of these variables, right, because they didn't work. The only one that worked, quote, was the actual physical age. We use father's age to control. And so basically, what's shown in red in the first paragraph there, the sort of key thing, had you not controlled for father's age, in other words, you ran a straight analysis of variance, you don't get that effect. And just out of curiosity, the contrast effect that they found in the first study, so you feel older after listening to a child's story, or song I should say, does not obtain here. So the point, very simply, is that people tend to be leaving out a lot of really key details, and that's problematic. And so after a period of time, what we ended up doing at Psych Science, that was introduced in January 2014, after a lot of haggling with editors and so forth, was to come up with a disclosure statement that now everyone has to complete when they submit a paper to Psych Science. And basically, they have to confirm, as indicated here, the total number of excluded observations and the reasons for making those exclusions. I'm not going to go through them all in great detail here. They have to confirm that the independent variables or manipulations, whether successful or failed, have all been reported. The third is they have to confirm that all dependent variables or measures that were analyzed for the article's target research question have also been reported. You don't selectively report. And finally, you have to confirm that how you determine your sample size and your data collection stopping rule are also reported. And there was some pushback from authors initially, but it's become normative now, and I think it's led to the journal being a lot better, that you're more likely to find more reliable results. That was one of 5, this disclosure statement was one of 5 initiatives that all rolled out at the same time. The others were to revise word limits. We took off limits on large parts of the paper so people could have a more fulsome account of what they did and what they found. We clarified the criteria for manuscript evaluation. We tried to get people to embrace new statistics, more of an emphasis on meta-analysis and estimation techniques rather than null hypothesis significance testing. And finally, wanted to also promote open science practices, not only through a disclosure statement, but also by the use of badges. And this is what David referred to before. So Psych Science was the launch vehicle for a Center of Open Science program that does seek to incentivize open communication with the research community. So articles accepted in 2014 or later in Psych Science could qualify for as many as 3 different badges to recognize authors for making their data material or publicly available or pre-registered design and analysis. And there are the 3: open data, open materials, and pre-registered that he was showing just before. Very briefly, as of December 2015, 25% of Psych Science articles had received either an open data or an open materials badge. Very few pre-registered badges had been awarded, but that you have to decide well in advance of actually doing your work. That's likely to change in 2016, and it's beginning to do so now, because before I left, it was required that all articles reporting direct replications have to be pre-registered. And finally, open data, and to a lesser extent, open materials badges seem to be surprisingly effective nudges. And that's the last point I just want to talk about here. Recently, a month or so ago, there was a paper that was reported in PLOS Biology. It was an awesome paper by Mallory Kidwell and colleagues at Center for Open Science. It's a busy graph, but what's shown sort of at the bottom, if you see sort of the gray or darkish kind of lines, that indicates by year some other like major journals in psychology. The Journal of Experimental Psychology developmental psychology, and a couple others as well. And it shows how many of those publications over time actually had open data, provided open data. And the answer is very low. It's around 2%, 3%. The red line indicates psych science. The red line up until when we introduced the badges was also kind of low, pathetically low, 2 or 3%. But since then, actually, their data indicate we're now up to around 40% or so. So it's a surprisingly small thing, you would think, that a badge would seem to work. And in fact, actually, Kidwell's article has gotten a fair amount of media attention. It's written up in Nature and a couple other places. As one, I think it was in 538, they noted that as all psychologists needed to be more open with their data was the promise of a badge showing that they did it. And fittingly, it was titled, as a psychologist, I like this, even psychologists respond to meaningless rewards. So, but nevertheless, meaningless as it may be, it works. My hope is, I'm no longer at the job, I do other things now, but my hope was this would be a way station to get to exactly where Helen is now in PLOS, where it would just become normative that everyone now makes these data available. We're not quite there yet, but I think it's getting in that direction. Okay, thank you.